right, welcome everybody to another broadcast of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your favorite conservatarian, me, Jeff Charles. And I have another fire guest for you guys today. He hails from Northern Virginia. He is a man in Washington for the Tea Party Patriots. I give you Bill Pascoe. How are you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, Jeff. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. It's almost Friday. It's almost the weekend. And I still work on weekends, but I'm a little bit more relaxed. So I'm excited for it.
I know the feeling.
Yeah.
You're fast enough.
Yeah. So you've got your finger on the pulse on a few different issues, but what we're going to be talking about is the For the People Act. But before we get into that, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Who is Bill Pascoe, and what do you do for the Tea Party Patriots?
Well, I am Tea Party Patriots man in Washington. I view Washington as an occupied capital. So I'm kind of like I'm kind of like a war correspondent behind enemy lines, trying to report back to the good patriots around the country what the heck is going on in this occupied capital. The fact of the matter is that the biggest political divide in America today is not between Republicans and Democrats, or even between liberals and conservatives. The way I see it, the biggest divide is between the Washington establishment and everybody else, all of those of us who pay for the Washington establishment. Steny Hoyer and Kevin McCarthy have more in common with one another than either one of them has in common with you and me. And that's the way we view it. This is an occupied city. It's occupied by invaders who do not pay attention to the Constitution. They've created an unconstitutional extra-legal government. And we believe that at Tea Party Patriots, anyway, we are working as hard as we can to get the government back inside the constitutional restraints that were put there almost 250 years ago. That's why we appreciate guys like you, Jeff, who are doing what you can to spread that message around the country. It's absolutely necessary. We're in a critical fight as we approach the 250th anniversary of our founding documents. And so we really appreciate the time that we're going to spend today talking about some of these crucial issues that are before the Congress right now.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you put it that way. It's more about the people like us, the rank and file, the everyman, against the elites in both parties. I mean, I get a lot of people who get mad at me when I criticize Republicans, because I criticize Republicans a lot. I also criticize Democrats too, even though I'm a conservative, but I'm not afraid to criticize the Republican Party. But I'm trying to tell people, these people are not necessarily your friends. Just because they have an R next to their name doesn't mean they're there for you. I mean, that's why the Tea Party movement started in the first place. So
you're absolutely right. And as far as Tea Party activism is concerned, it's kind of interesting. I'm probably closer to the Republican establishment than most Tea Party activists. I've actually worked for the party. In the 2000 cycle, I was the press secretary for the Republican National Committee.
Okay.
I managed statewide campaigns for Republican candidates running for governor and running for the U.S. Senate. I've been doing politics. I've been involved in politics. The first campaign I ever worked was Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign. I was still in college then. So it's been 41 years now of working to advance liberty. I've worked at the State Department during the Reagan administration, working on Central America. I worked at the Heritage Foundation.
Wow.
I've worked at the American Conservative Union. Probably the best job I ever had. I will take 30 seconds to tell you. I worked for a billionaire philanthropist who hired me to smuggle his money and computers behind the Iron Curtain in 1989 and 1990.
Wow.
I was actually in Moscow conducting a political training conference for Democratic activists, a secret training conference on the day the Berlin Wall fell. We didn't know for 2 days because we got the loop of the May Day parade. That's all the Soviet television would show for 48 hours while they were trying to figure out, are they going to send in the tanks or not? And I recognized from my own knowledge of history, I knew when they show the May Day parade on an endless loop on the TV, that means something big is going on and there's a decision to be made. We couldn't phone home. All the international phone lines were blocked in Moscow for a couple of days while they were trying to figure out what was going on. And finally, after 2 days, one of the guys who was with me on the trip was able to get through to his wife. And he came back and said, "You're not going to believe it, but the Berlin Wall is down. The Germans are crossing over." And we were just ecstatic, obviously. So that was the best gig I'll ever have, I will tell you.
Well, that's fascinating. at some point, I'm gonna have to have you back on just to talk about that, because I've got so many questions that I can't don't have time to ask right now. But yeah, I mean, you've obviously have a wealth of experience, and so we're going to be getting some insights from you on this issue with the For the People Act.
Yeah.
Now this has been, bandied about, and I know Democrats are pushing it hard. What before we get into it, what is the For the People Act as what it's supposed to be?
Well, it's an 800-page omnibus election reform bill, if you will. You know how every year they're supposed to pass 12 different individual appropriations bills, and they never do. And so at the end of the fiscal year in September, they're going to take 12 big bills, each one of which is a big bill by its own standard, and they wrap them all together, and they call it an omnibus. Well, that's what we've got here. We've got more than 60 different pieces of legislation having to do with the way we administer elections, having to do with the way we regulate political speech that has nothing to do with elections, by the way. Let's say a group of citizens wanted to band together, pool their resources because they had a point of view. Let's say they think S1 and HR1 are terrible pieces of legislation, and they think that Joe Manchin in West Virginia might be a crucial vote on this. How is he going to vote? Well, let's try to influence his vote. So they put a 30-second TV spot on the air in West Virginia. They've raised a couple $100,000 and they purchased airtime. And so this bill would require disclosure of all the donors to that ad. Right now, that's not required because it's an issue ad. It has nothing to do with Joe Manchin's election, but it mentions a candidate for office. And so under this new law, they want to force disclosure, even though in 1958, more than 60 years ago, the Supreme Court took up the case of NAACP versus Alabama. The state of Alabama wanted to know the donors and the members and the supporters of the NAACP. And the NAACP in Alabama said, oh, no. We know why you want the list of donors, because let's be honest here. And they said, we have a First Amendment right to freedom of association, and we have a First Amendment right to privacy on this, and we don't think you have the right to our donor list. And the Supreme Court looked at it, and in a 9-0 decision, the Supreme Court came down on the side of donor privacy and said that the right to freedom of association implies the right to privacy in that association, and no state entity has the right to force you to disclose. Democrats think that's a terrible idea. Why? Because they want to dox the donors, because they want to show up at the donors' homes and intimidate them. I'm getting too much into the weeds on this one thing. So let's go back. What S1 does? First off, it federalizes elections. Right now, under the constitutional scheme, elections are administered by the 50 states, and each state has its own set of laws. And we find that in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution tells you that the state legislatures have the power to set the times, manners, and places of choosing senators and representatives. Now, it does also say that Congress may alter those arrangements by law. So what the Democrats are trying to do here is not unconstitutional, and let's get that straight. The Constitution says that the Congress does have the power to oversee the states, and Congress can pass a law that has to do with election administration in one form or another. It's not unconstitutional. It's just bad what they want.
It's wrong. Yeah.
Very, very bad. So they basically want to take all election administration and federalize it. Give you an example. In 36 states right now, there are requirements for some kind of voter identification when you show up to vote. I'm Bill Pascoe. In the state of Virginia, they asked me for my driver's license. Okay. And in 36 states total, there's a requirement to produce some form of identification to prove that I am who I say I am. Under S1, that's gone. That's out the window.
For all 50 states.
In all 50 states, out the window. This is something that's supported by 75% of voters. 60% of Democratic voters support voter ID. So in this case, it's not a question of Democratic Party elites responding to demands from their constituents. We can't have voter identification. That's a terrible thing. In this case, it's Democratic Party elites doing it not because of their constituents, but in spite of their constituents, in opposition to their own constituents. Why? Because they've come to the conclusion that this is how Democratic Party elites can stay in power for the next 100 years. I'll give you another example. For 30 years now in Washington, liberal political activists have been trying to get taxpayer funding of campaigns. Now they introduce it. They say, no, we're not going to rule out private funding. We just want to have a pilot program to see if this can work. So let's test it. Well, the test means they want to have public funding of campaigns, because once you establish the principle of public funding of campaigns, which is a bad idea in itself, let's face
Right.
it, of all the people who need welfare, who need taxpayer money thrown at them, it's not politicians, right? It's not politicians. They got corporations throwing money at them. They got labor unions throwing money at them. They got groups on the left and groups on the right throwing money at them. They don't need to be digging their noses into the taxpayer trough to pay for their campaigns, for crying out loud. But the reason they want this is because once they establish the principle of public funding, then they can say, well, we shouldn't have private funding, because private funding is all dark. That's corrupt by its own nature. So we're going to get rid of now that we've established public.
Because the government is never corrupt, is it?
I'm shocked to find that you might even consider that, Jeff. So once you get public funding coming online, then you can get rid of the private funding. And that's important, because once you get rid of the private funding 20 years from now, and you've established the principle that all campaigns should be funded by the public, then guess what? Then you can control all political speech. Because political speech, back in 1976, the Supreme Court took on a very important case about First Amendment rights and free speech, Buckley v. Vallejo. The Supreme Court basically said that in a mass communication society, where television and radio are necessary to communicate a message to the broad mass of the population, guess what? That requires money. So the Supreme Court basically said money equals speech.
Right.
Well, what they're doing here is they're getting rid of the private money, so they control all political speech through public money. And once you control all political speech through public money, you'll be able to determine which speech is worthy of being funded by public money. Oh, no, we can't say that. Guess what? All you got to do is watch what Facebook and Twitter did at the end of last year. Remember the New York Post article about the Hunter Biden laptop? How that was absolutely verboten. You couldn't mention that. If you mentioned that, your account was frozen or taken down on the social media platforms. Now, imagine that same kind of stuff with the coercive power of the federal government added to it. That's what we're talking about, just in that one provision. So now we've talked about voter ID. We've talked about public funding of campaigns. Let's talk about the Federal Election Commission. Mm-hmm. The Federal Election Commission was created in the mid-1970s. We had a big money scandal. It was called Watergate. And so they created the Federal Election Campaign Act to regulate the flow of money into campaigns. And one of the things they did was they established a new federal body called the Federal Election Commission. And they said, we want this to be a nonpartisan election watchdog. So they deliberately set it up with 3 Republican commissioners and 3 Democrat commissioners. And in order to do anything, it requires 4 votes. That way, there has to be bipartisan buy-in. Mm-hmm. You can't do anything unless you get at least 1 member from the other side to join you in the enforcement action, right? So it's not Democrats in control punishing Republican candidates, or it's not Republicans in control punishing Democrat candidates. It's got to be bipartisan. Under this new bill, that's out the window. We'll have 2 Republican commissioners, 2 Democrat commissioners, and a 5th, a chairman, who will be appointed by whoever wins the White House. So in this case, if Joe Biden had just won the White House, he would then control for the next 4 years, he would control the Federal Election Commission, and it would go from being a nonpartisan watchdog into being a partisan attack dog. So that's just 3 of the massive changes. Here's the big picture takeaway. When you step back, you go to 60,000 feet, and you look down from the bird's eye view, what's going on here is Democrats are trying to take a very slim majority that they had, a temporary majority in the House. They got a 5-vote majority in the House. They're tied in the Senate. The only reason they have a majority there is because of the constitutional provision that says the vice president gets to break a tie. Mm-hmm. So very slim majorities that are only in place for this Congress for 2 years, but the Democrats are trying to take that slim temporary majority and turn it into a permanent majority by changing the rules. If this bill were to go through, I guarantee you, Democrats would be able to maintain political control for the next century. It is that bad. It is so foundational an attack on the very premises of our government. Separation of powers is gone. Any idea of nonpartisan election administration is out the window. We'll have automatic voter registration in every state in the union. We will be registering. It's so incredible. Not only do they create automatic voter registration, they create automatic voter registration for anybody who's on certain government databases. Wait a minute, certain government databases, like what? Oh, like food stamps, like welfare, like going to the DMV, going to the Division of Motor Vehicles. Well, guess what? You don't have to be a citizen to go to the DMV. You don't even have to be
Sure
a
don't.
citizen to get food stamps or welfare in this country, which means if they're using those databases as the new voter rolls, and that's what they're going to do, because they're going to register everybody who's on those databases, then by definition, you are, I can't say for sure that it is deliberate. So I'll just say inadvertently, you will sweep up illegal immigrants into your new voter rolls. And there's another provision that says it's now a felony to challenge anybody's right to vote. What? Wait a second. So you just made it.
I knew it was bad, but I didn't know it was this bad. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's remarkable. Senator Cruz even tried to strike this in the markup session they had on Tuesday in the Senate. He said, you guys are insisting that we're not going to inadvertently register any illegal immigrants. We're not so sure that's right. But if it's accurate that you won't be able to register illegal immigrants, then certainly we should be able to get rid of this provision that makes it a felony to challenge anybody's registration, right? Since nobody's going to be registered who shouldn't be registered, then it shouldn't be against the law to challenge somebody's registration. That's not going to be a problem for you, is it?
Right.
And the Democrats said no, and all 9 Democrats voted against the Cruz amendment to remove the provision making it a felony to challenge somebody's voter registration. This is crazy. It's utter absurdity.
So, wow. So obviously, I mean, this seems like, I mean, and I tend to be pretty cynical. So yes, the Democrats are doing this so that they can have an electoral advantage. Now, what is the chance of this passing? I mean, are there Democrats other than perhaps Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema that are opposing this, or?
Well, yes and no. So there's 50 Democrats in the Senate. There's 48 Democrats in the Senate and 2 independents. Angus King from Maine and Bernie Sanders from Vermont are actually technically independents. They caucus with the Democrats. So we'll say for our purposes in this discussion, there are 50 Democrats in the Senate. 49 of them have signed on as co-sponsors of this legislation. Joe Manchin from West Virginia has not. Now, what's interesting is in the previous Congress, when Republicans were in control of the Senate, all 50 Democrats, every Democrat in the Senate signed on as a co-sponsor back then when it was 53 to 47. So then you had 47 Democrat co-sponsors, including Manchin. Now, Manchin was able to sign on as a co-sponsor when Mitch McConnell was the majority leader because he knew no way in the world was Mitch McConnell going to bring this to the floor. So it was a free co-sponsorship. Manchin could be a good Democrat, a good loyal party guy.
Yeah.
Now, though, he looks at this, and this is very interesting. Joe Manchin has 2 things that are very important to this particular debate on this particular piece of legislation. He's not just the senator from West Virginia. He's a former Secretary of State of West Virginia. Before he was the senator, he was the governor. Before he was the governor, he was the Secretary of State. So he was actually the election official. He was the state official in charge of election administration statewide. He dealt with all the county boards of elections. He knows what it is to administer an election. And he's looking at this thing and he's thinking, wow, we're making an awful lot of changes here. We're putting a lot of burden on boards of elections and secretaries of state, and we're not giving them a lot of time. So that's his first problem, is he just thinks, even if you want to make all these changes, you're not giving the people who are actually going to have to make the changes on the front lines, the people who are going to respond to new deadlines, you're not giving them enough time. He's got that problem. Second, he inhabits the seat that was once held by Robert Byrd. Robert Byrd, we think of in many different ways. We all remember that Robert Byrd was a member of the KKK. Robert is a conservative Southern Democrat. Robert Byrd is also, I would put him in the top 3 of greatest members of the Senate in history in terms of defending the roles, the prerogatives of the Senate. And Robert Byrd, I mean, we now have something called the Byrd Rule that applies when we use the process known as reconciliation, a law, a procedure that they created in the mid-70s, again, because of that Nixon administration, which was Richard Nixon had many things going with the Congress. One of them was very contentious, very, very contentious relationship with Congress. So we got some legislation that occurred as a result of the Nixon administration. And one of them is the Budget and Impoundment Control Act that we now use today for the process called reconciliation. That's how the Democrats, even though it's a 50-50 Senate, they can still muscle something through. That's how they got the $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package through. They can bypass the filibuster for some specific pieces of legislation. Manchin is very proud of the fact that he inhabits the seat that was once held by Robert Byrd. And he doesn't like people screwing around with the rules of the Senate. So he's looking at this and he's saying, you know what, this is foundational. This election administration, election reform bill that you're talking about goes to the very heart of our constitutional republic. This is not something we should do on a partisan basis. This is something that must be bipartisan in order to have any chance of success and being appreciated by the American public. You can't pass this on a party line vote. So he's saying, we're not going to use reconciliation because some Democrats have suggested this is so important, we should use the reconciliation process and bypass the filibuster so the Senate Republicans who are evil and obstructionists, we're not going to let them bottle this thing up using the filibuster. He says, no, we are going to have to talk to the Republicans because if you try to use reconciliation, I'm not going to vote for it. And if he doesn't vote for it, then you don't get the 50-50 tie. You would have 51 votes against and only 49 votes in favor. He has the power. And this is the beauty of the Senate. The way the founders set it up, one senator can gum up the works. In the House, on the other side, on any given day, a majority in the House can do just about anything it wants. You get 218 votes, you can say the sun is going to rise in the west tomorrow. And that's the law. And they can pass that, and that's that. In the Senate, all it takes is one guy to gum up the works. And that's what Manchin is doing. So it's a long way of answering your question. What are the chances for passage? Right now, the chances are very good that this bill dies in the Senate. The only way that they could move it through the Senate is if Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema from Arizona were to decide this is so important that we will agree to a one-time rule change to bypass the filibuster. But Manchin is in the news today for something he told ABC News just yesterday, just last night. He was interviewed and they asked him specifically about this possibility. Is there any way in the world that even on a one-time use thing that you might be willing to look the other way on the filibuster to advance the voting bill? And he said, no, because if you do it one time, you've destroyed the Senate.
It opens the door. Yeah.
Absolutely right. Because once you've done it one time, why wouldn't you do it a second time? Why wouldn't you? So we got to keep conservatives everywhere should be writing and calling and texting and tweeting to Joe Manchin to say, stand strong for the filibuster, stand strong for the need for bipartisan election reform. If you want to do this, you got to get Republican buy-in. That's the only way you can make changes this big and have them stick. And what you don't want to do, and let's talk just for a moment about the filibuster, because this is so important. The filibuster is what makes the Senate different from the House.
Right.
The filibuster, and the filibuster is not some evil thing. You know, they made a run at it about 6 weeks ago. The left, all the talk show, MSNBC, Morning News at Night, and the New York Times editorial page. It was all about how the filibuster was a creature of white segregationists. It was white racists from the South who had created the filibuster. No, it wasn't.
And it was them who were using it all last year. So, I mean, they don't believe this. I mean, they don't actually believe this. They know that what they're saying is crap. They just want to get rid of it so they can have an advantage. That's it.
Exactly. So the filibuster, but the filibuster is important. It's important that people understand. The filibuster is simply a rule for more than 100 years. And we're going to get into parliamentary procedure here. And anybody who has been to see Hamilton knows, without realizing it, they know one of the key players in the development of the filibuster, and that is Hamilton's opponent, Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was vice president to Thomas Jefferson from 1801 to 1805. He ran against Jefferson to be president. And remember, in the original constitutional construction, They cast the electoral votes, and whoever got the most electoral votes became president, and the second place finisher got to be vice president.
Right.
So, I mean, imagine if Donald Trump, under that scheme, Joe Biden would be president and Donald Trump would now be vice president. That would be
awesome. Could you imagine the show that would be? It'd be absolutely hilarious.
Oh my goodness. Well, we actually had something like it many years ago in California. You had the same situation where the governor and the lieutenant governor were elected separately, and the governor was Jerry Brown, Democrat, liberal Democrat then, and the lieutenant governor was a Republican by the name of Mike Kerr. And every time Jerry Brown would leave the state on a trade mission or going to Washington or something like that, the lieutenant governor would be in charge, and he would do whatever he could to undo the things that Jerry Brown had been doing. And it got to the point where Jerry Brown just wouldn't leave the state because he knew that his lieutenant governor was going to undermine. Anyway, so Aaron Burr was the vice president. And as he was, everybody remembers George Washington's famous farewell address, where he talked about no entangling alliances. Don't get allied to foreigners because we don't want to be drawn into their wars because of our alliances with them.
Right.
Nobody remembers Aaron Burr's farewell address, except for historians of the Senate who note that one of the things he said in his farewell address as vice president, he said, by the way, you guys have a lot of rules in your rule book here in the Senate, and you don't use them all. And one of them is the motion to order the previous question. Now, this is a parliamentary maneuver that's in every parliament in the world. It's in the House of Representatives. We order the previous question. That's a fancy name for call up the bill so we can vote on it. Okay, that's what it means in parliamentary terms. Call up the bill so we can vote on it. He said in the Senate, you guys don't use this rule. You should just clean up your rule book. It's got too many rules that you don't use. Just edit it with a red pen and change things. Shrink your rule book. Make yourself more clean, more efficient. And so they did. They removed the order of the previous question, and they did that in 1806. And what that meant was there was no way to force an end to debate. And for more than 100 years, there was no way that you could force an end to debate in the Senate. We had filibusters beginning in the 1830s. First filibuster that we know was in 1837. And it was over a question of where are we going to build a bridge between because remember at that time there was part of Virginia was part of the federal capital. What is now the county of Arlington in Virginia had been ceded to the District of Columbia. And so the federal government needed to build a bridge. And the first filibuster actually came about over a piece of legislation to define where we're going to build that bridge. Okay, it had nothing to do with segregation, nothing to do with slavery. It wasn't until 1917 in World War I when President Wilson tried to get a measure passed by the Congress, and he couldn't get the Senate, which opposed it. There were several members of the Senate who opposed this piece of legislation, and he couldn't get the Senate to even bring the bill to a vote. And he was finally able to prevail upon them to add a rule. So they added a rule to the Senate that allows for a supermajority of the Senate to decide that, okay, we've had enough debate. It's time to actually call the bill up for a vote. At the time, it was a requirement for a 2/3 vote of the members of the Senate.
Right.
It has since been reduced to a 3/5 vote. 60 votes is what it takes. But all it means is that a supermajority of the Senate is now ready to go to debate. Now, the interesting thing is, I went back and I looked over the last 61 years, going back to 1960. During that time, there have been precisely 4 Congresses. And if we go to the 1970s, if we look at the last 42 years, going back to 1978, so since the presidency of Jimmy Carter, there's only been 1 year in all of those Congresses where one party had enough of a majority in the Senate that they could pass legislation without need for a single vote from the other side. And that happened to be in the first year of Barack Obama's term. Calendar year 2009, there were 60 Democrat senators. There were 60 Democrats until Ted Kennedy died. And you may remember Ted Kennedy was replaced in that special election, not by a Democrat. Everybody assumed it was going to be the Democrat Martha Coakley, but instead she was defeated by Scott Brown. And one of the ways that Scott Brown won that race was because he realized that he could campaign to be the 41st vote against Obamacare. That was when we were discussing Obamacare.
Oh, right,
And
right,
he
right.
ran an entire campaign. Elect me and I will be the 41st vote. They won't be able to break the filibuster. And he got elected. And that's why they had to accept. We had already had a bill pass the Senate. Remember, in Christmas, it was Christmas Eve of 2009. The bill passed the Senate with 60 votes. And that was when we had the Louisiana Purchase, when they offered stuff to Mary Landrieu, and we had Ben Nelson in Nebraska, um, and they were doing everything they could to line up the Democratic senators. They got 60 votes in the Senate. Then they went to the House and they passed the bill in the House, but the House bill was slightly different. They wanted to go back to the Senate, but when they went back to the Senate, they didn't have 60 votes anymore in the Senate, so they couldn't pass the House bill. They had to move a reconciliation bill. And so they moved a second reconciliation bill. It gets very complicated. The point is, only 1 year out of the last 42 years has there been a large enough majority in the Senate for that party to be able to pass legislation without needing at least one vote from the other side. The filibuster is designed to force compromise. That's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
It's a good thing when we're talking about the kind of legislation that's going to affect everybody for years and decades to come. I think it's reasonable that we should hope that the two parties can find a way to come to agreement over some of these things. We shouldn't be passing major legislation on party line votes. That's not a good thing for stability.
Yeah, no, it sure isn't. But unfortunately, a lot of the elites don't care. So, but I'm glad we were able to have this conversation, because I think a lot of people don't know exactly how deep this bill runs. So I'm sure we'll talk about it more as time goes on. But I definitely appreciate you joining me. Why don't you tell the audience where they can find you?
On Twitter, I'm at WPascoe. That's WPASCOE. More importantly, though, they should find me at teapartypatriots.org. Every week, I post an update about what's going on in Washington. Tells you here's what happened in the House, here's what happened in the Senate, and here's how they're going to try and pull the wool over our eyes in the next week and what we can do about it. Teapartypatriots.org is where they can find that. Just look for the Washington Report.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff.
Thank you.